Okay, so good afternoon to all of you. My name is Miryam Nahon. I have 30 years experience as a conference interpreter. I'm a member of AIC, the Association Internationale d'Interprètes de Conférences, in English, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. I'm also a member of ISRAIIC, which is a non-lucrative professional association of conference interpreters in Israel. It's actually the Israel branch of AIC. ISRAIIC's purpose is to uphold AIC's code of ethics and professional standards in Israel, to improve working conditions of conference interpreters in Israel, and in general terms, to defend the professional interests of its members and the profession itself. I'm going to talk to you today about interpreting ISO standards. Let's begin by sharing the presentation. Just a second. Okay. So interpreting ISO standards. I don't seem to be able to move forward in the presentation. Let me just check why this is it. So ISO stands for International Standards Organization. It was founded in 1947. It is made of technical committees, which are groups of experts focusing on a specific subject. It's an independent body, it's non-governmental, and it's an international organization. I point that out because it's important to understand that ISO works globally. ISO brings together experts who share their knowledge to develop international standards. These standards are voluntary, and by that I mean that it is not obligatory to comply with the requirements of standards. It is up to the companies or bodies or organizations in general terms. Nevertheless, countries may decide to impose those requirements as compulsory and not voluntary in their countries where they have jurisdiction. These standards are consensus-based. That is, they are reached by consensus and they are market relevant. ISO has a vision for 2030. Its vision is to make lives easier, safer, and better. And it has a mission to bring together people to agree on international standards that respond to global challenges. ISO has three main goals: that ISO standards be used everywhere, and they have strategies to comply or to achieve these goals. So these standards have to be bring benefits, and these benefits have to be demonstrated. They want to innovate in order to meet users' needs, so they don't always come after the deed, but sometimes they try to understand what the needs will be for the future. They they want to meet global needs, so when they deliver ISO standards, it's because the market needs them. And ISO tries to capture future opportunities for international standardization. ISO would like to have all voices heard. As I said, it works on the basis of consensus. It wants in the future to strengthen ISO members through capacity building and advance inclusivity and diversity in order to listen to each and every one of the voices that may be an interested party in any subject that it deals with. So ISO provides a platform to develop these practical tools that we call standards through common understanding and cooperation with all the stakeholders. The platform is basically ISO's central secretariat, which works for ISO with professionals. Then you have ISO members. These are more than 160 national standards bodies. So the members of ISO are actually the standardization bodies of each country. And it also has experts which are nominated by either ISO members or by partner organizations. ISO is organized in more than 300 technical committees, each dealing with a specific subject. And these are divided into subcommittees. In our case, in the case of interpretation, the technical committee that deals with interpretation is the Language and Terminology Technical Committee, TC37. And this committee is subdivided in subcommittees dealing with principles and methods, with terminology, workflow, and language coding, with management of terminology resources, with language resource management, and finally, with translation, interpreting, and related technology. This subcommittee has published 18 standards, and they are working on 7 further standards. The subcommittees themselves are divided into working groups. So going back a little bit, we have Technical Committee 37, which is language and terminology, subcommittee number 5 dealing with translation, interpreting, and related technology. And within that subcommittee, we have working group 1 dealing with translation, working group 2 interpretation, 3 facilities and equipment for interpreting services, 4 teaching and training of interpreters, and AHJA1, which is remote interpreting in community interpretation. So what are ISO standards that have to do with translation? Let's begin with published standards. We have a standards on translation project with general guidance from 2012. We have translation services, requirements for translation services from 2015. In 2017, there was an amendment on the translation services requirements. Then we have post-editing of machine translation output with different requirements. Translation, interpreting, and related technology vocabulary, which is the standard which is common both to translation and interpretation. We have a standard on legal translation with different requirements, and there's a technical standard on internet formats. ISO is also working in further standards related to translation. There's a standard for evaluation of translation output with general guidance. There's a review of the translation projects and the translation, interpretation, and related technology vocabulary, which is an ongoing process because there's vocabulary coming up all the time. Regarding interpreting, we have a standard from 2016, actually 2 standards, 2 technical standards on permanent booths and mobile booths. These are the 2 technical standards that we have in ISO, and then we have guidelines for community interpreting. In 2018, there was a standard published on interpreting services with general requirements and recommendation. This standard itself includes all forms of interpretation. So it would include community interpreting, conference interpreting, legal interpreting, and healthcare interpreting, together with medical interpreting. In 2007, a standard was published on the quality and transmission of sound and image, which is also a technical standard. This is targeted at technicians or providers of interpreting equipment. Then we have another one on equipment itself. Again, it's a technical standard. We have legal interpreting requirements from 2019. And again, the vocabulary, which is something ongoing. This standard was published in 2019, but as you will see, there's a continuous work on it. In 2020, a healthcare interpreting standard was published with requirements and recommendations. In 2019, again, equipment. So this was a review of the previous one. And here we get to the latest standard published on interpretation. Interpreting services, conference interpreting, requirements and recommendations. This standard was approved in January 2022, that's about a month ago. And I shall speak about this standard more later. There's also a standard on delivery platforms, which is especially relevant for this new modality of distance interpretation. And then we have other standards that ISO is working on. For example, we have requirements for interpreter educators and teaching and training programs. We have, again, community interpreting, which is a review of the previous one. We have equipment, which is technical, and again, it's a review of the previous one, vocabulary that we have mentioned quite a few times, and delivery platforms. So what's ISRAIIC's role in ISO? During the last decade, ISO has launched a whole series of projects that are related to interpreting, and ISRAIIC has coordinated its contributions to ISO standards since 2012 through the ISO Standards Project. So in ISRAIIC, there's an ISO group, a group of persons who coordinate everything that has to do with standards. ISRAIIC officially holds the status of partner of the type Liaison A in the Technical Committee 37, Subcommittee 5 since April 2014. A Liaison A partner is an organization that can make an effective contribution to the work of the technical committee or subcommittee for questions dealt with by this technical committee. It can make its voice heard. It can make suggestions or comments or suggested changes, but it does not have the right to vote. The only ones that can vote in these committees and subcommittees are the national standards bodies, and there's only one vote per national standard body. Some members of ISRAIIC are also experts at a national or at an international level. So what's ISRAIIC's interest in ISO? Going back to the vision of ISO, making lives easier, safer, and better. What does ISRAIIC want? In fact, it wants to make life easier, safer, and better in the interpreting world. So to begin with, as an international standard is always the result of consensus. And ISRAIIC wants to be part of that consensus, which is reached among all the stakeholders. We are all, I think, interested in having a unification of criteria when it comes to interpretation. We want our profession to be recognized. We want, of course, to be healthy. We want to work and not get sick or ill because of working conditions. We want to have guidance. We want to have trust. We want to be professional, obviously. We want simplification. We want to be effective. All in all, what we want is to have quality interpreting, and ISO standards is one way of achieving that. Now we have to take into account that sometimes countries may approve national standards even before ISO, but once a standard is adopted by ISO, the national standardization bodies may very often adopt them and adapt them to depending on their local needs. Let's go back to ISO 23155, which is the standard that I mentioned before that was published rather in January 2022, and it deals specifically with conference interpreting. It states the requirements and recommendations of conference interpreting, not only for interpreters, but also for service providers, as well as users of conference interpreting services. Like any standard, of course, you need to purchase it if you want to read it, and you cannot copy it or use it in any way. Now, what's the content of this ISO standard? It states a number of concepts. This is very common in ISO standards. There are definitions so that we all know what we're talking about. So we need to first agree upon what we mean when we say sign language or source language or target language or working languages ABC. For example, my working languages are A, Spanish, B, English, and C, Hebrew, Portuguese, and French. And what does that mean? An A language is the language that you master best, usually your mother tongue, in my case, Spanish. You interpret from all the other languages that you know into that language. A B language is a language that you master not as well as a mother tongue, but well enough to interpret into it. So English is my B language. And then I have Hebrew, French, and Portuguese that I interpret from, but I don't interpret to. In fact, I'm already interpreting into Hebrew, and I'm planning to move this C language and turn it into a B language. We need to agree upon how we call the different parties that are involved in conference interpreting. We have speakers, we have conference interpreters, we have consultant interpreters, we have clients, which are not necessarily the person listening to the interpretation. We have different modes of interpretation. We have things like the cognitive load while interpreting, which is, for example, heavier if we are interpreting remotely. And then, of course, there's the equipment, the settings, the interpreting system, the booth, the console. Then the standard goes on to explain what the different modes of interpreting are. You have consecutive interpreting. For those who don't know, that means that a person speaks, then they stop, and then the interpreter will repeat what the speaker said in the second language. Simultaneous would be with the microphone and with headphones, with a booth, and you would be interpreting simultaneously. Whispered is a sort of simultaneous interpretation in cases when the person is moving around. Say, for example, you have a conference and then you have a visit of the premises. You have to accompany the persons to the visit, and you will be whispering simultaneously in their ear. Usually you would not whisper to more than 2 persons, obviously, because then otherwise it would be a pandemonium. And you have sign language interpretation, which is not a new mode of interpretation, but it is new in terms of conference interpreting. We have a few years ago in ISRAIIC decided to include sign language as a form of conference interpretation, and we have now members that are sign language interpreters. ISO standard 23155 speaks as well about what we call team strength and working hours. Team strength means that you need to know how to make up a team depending on the languages that are going to be used, how much each language is going to be used, what is the length of the interpreting assignment, etc. So you need to have basically at least 2 interpreters. You should never be working alone in the booth. The number of interpreters in a given assignment will depend on the number of languages, the duration, the difficulty as well. You need to set a standard, and that's what this standard does regarding how many hours to work and how many breaks you should have in between. And it even says that distance interpreting entails additional cognitive load, as I mentioned before. There should be, according to this standard, teamwork between conference interpreters. You need to be able to work with your colleague in the booth and with other colleagues from other booths. There has to be communication between the interpreters. There has to be coordination between the interpreters. There's a code of ethics with the standard in its annex gives an example of a code of ethics. And then it also speaks about the competencies and qualifications of conference interpreters in terms of intellectual competencies, linguistic, communicative, a long list of different skills and competencies that interpreters should have in order to do their job as conference interpreters. It also speaks about qualifications. Who can be an interpreter? Either you have a degree or you've passed an accreditation test by an international organization, for example. The standard also speaks about assignments. It states, of course, that there is total confidentiality. An interpreter may learn many different things in its interpreting work. And of course, all the things that he hears are confidential unless they are public. It speaks about what you should do before assignments, what you should do during assignments, and what you should do after assignments. Before assignments, for example, you should be aware of the fact that you should only accept an assignment if you feel qualified to carry out the assignment. You have to prepare. You have to make sure that all the travel arrangements have been made in order for you to arrive at the conference if it's an in-person conference. During the conference, you need to be basically professional as an interpreter with everything that means. And after the conference, you should be able to do a debriefing with your customer to make sure that you can continuously improve your work. Now, the standard states also requirements for conference interpreting service providers. It speaks about the quality of the service. It speaks about recruiting conference interpreters or dealing with all the financial or travel arrangements, the equipment that has to be used. There are requirements relating to the clients. There are requirements relating to interpreters, for example. And then it has the standard has different annexes. Annex A speaks about the conference interpreting workflow. Annex B speaks about, or rather gives an example of a code of conduct for conference interpreters. Annex C deals with the content of an assignment agreement. Annex D speaks about the head of the team. In every team of interpreters, there's a head of the team who is responsible for the coordination between all the interpreters. Annex E speaks about team strength for simultaneous interpreting, and Annex F speaks about customary practice when recruiting conference interpreters. Now let's move on to certification and accreditation. We have spoken about standards themselves. And now we're going to talk about certification, which is used to add credibility by stating that an organization complies with a number of standards. Now, certification is provided by an independent body stating that the service or the product, in our case, service, meets specific requirements. Accreditation, on the other hand, is the formal recognition by an independent body that the certification body meets international standards. Let me explain what I've just said. You have independent bodies that issue standards. ISO is the international standard organization that issues international standards. Then you have the national standardization bodies. For example, in Israel, we have Nahon ISRAIIC. That would be the national standardization body in the case of Israel. Now, these standardization bodies may or may not also be certification entities. And they may grant accreditation to other independent entities who would then be responsible for certification. ISO, for example, does not perform certification. ISO will not give you permission to put a stamp saying that you are ISO certified. There are private companies, there are entities that are accredited to perform certification and provide the possibility to put that stamp. You are not allowed to say, I am ISO certified as a company or as an organization. It doesn't exist, such a thing. There's no such a thing as ISO certified. You may say, nevertheless, in the case of ISO 9001, that you are ISO 9001 2015 certified, or that you have that certification, but only if you have been certified by a certification entity. So remember, we said in ISO there are more than 160 national standards bodies. In the case of Israel, this national body is Nahon ISRAIIC, Standards Institution, the Standards Institution of Israel, Standards Institute. There's a mistake here. So Nahon ISRAIIC was created in 1923. It was a founding member of ISO. It's a public non-profit statutory organization empowered by the Standards Law of 1953. It deals with three main areas: standardization, testing, and certification. And you will understand these three different steps a little bit later when I explain the process. The Institute operates in close cooperation with different ministries, agencies, services, consumers, and the academic community as well. And it is the leading catalyst in all national activities enhancing quality and excellence. Now, the Standards Institute of Israel issues two types of standards: voluntary national standards, about 3,600 of them, and official standards, around 600 of them. When I say voluntary, what I mean is that you may produce something or provide a service, and it is up to you to be certified if you want to be certified, okay? An official standard, on the other hand, is a standard without which you cannot sell your product or you cannot provide your service. This happens usually in cases that involve health or safety. So the Standards Institute may say, for example, you cannot sell toys unless they are safe, unless you comply with a number of requirements that have to do with safety. Okay, so some goods imported or manufactured in Israel must comply with national official standards, as opposed to voluntary national standards. The SII is the certification body for national standards, which means that if you have to comply with them or you want to be certified with a national standard, you would have to get a stamp from the Standard Institute of Israel. And at the same time, it is one of the certification bodies for international standards. Let me try to explain this a little bit further. If you want to be ISO certified for a specific standard, you need to choose an international certification body. Okay, that may be, in the case of Israel, the Israel Institute of Standards, but it could also be other private companies that do so. There's a whole list in the IAF that you can find. If you want to be certified with a national standard, then you need to choose a national certification body. In our case, if you want to have what is called the TAV Tekem, you would have to get that from the Standard Institute of Israel. Now, you may stamp your service, interpretation in this case, as certified only after being authorized by a certification body. And in order to be authorized, you need to prove that you comply with requirements, and you may be subject to supervision by the certification body to that effect. So you cannot say, I comply with ISO 9001, for example, and just put a stamp in your papers. That is not allowed. If you want to do that, what you need to do is first choose a certification body. Let's give the example of ISO 9001, which is the broadest example. If you want to be certified as ISO 9001 compliant, then you would have to either get in touch with the Israel Institute of Standards or with different companies such as IQC, Next Step, JESCO, CBE. There's quite a big number of companies that will do that for you. You need to fill an application for certification and request a quote because it has a cost. You need to prepare for a certification test. Okay, so you need to learn what the requirements are, and you need to prepare your organization to make sure that you comply with those requirements. Then there will be someone coming either from the Israel Institute of Standards or from IQC to check whether you really comply with those requirements. They will write a report. They will say what you do comply with, but more importantly, they will say what you do not comply with and you need to correct. You will then proceed to correct the inconsistencies and you will finally be able to get certification. Now, the SII or the IQC or whichever body that you have chosen for this ISO standard may make follow-up visits to make sure that you still comply with the standard. Now, remember, this example was an example of an ISO standard. If we were talking about national standards, national Israeli standards, say, for example, you want to sell a product in Israel, if you want to import a product into Israel, then you need to get certification from the SII. That is the only organization that can provide the TAV Teken that we are all acquainted with. On the other hand, if you want to export to outside Israel, or you want to sell in Israel and say that you have an ISO certification, then you can either do that with SII or you can do that with IQC, Next Step, or any other company. So we have spoken about ISO, the International Standards Organization. We have spoken about the vision and the mission. We have mentioned the three main goals that they have. I have explained a little bit about the structure of ISO. Then we have spoken about how ISO standards are issued by technical committees, which are then divided into subcommittees and then into working groups, dealing each with more specific issues. We have spoken about translation standards, published and under development. We have mentioned interpreting standards as well. IIC's role in ISO, IIC's interest in ISO. I have explained a little bit further what the ISO 23155 conference interpreting is all about. And I have tried to explain certification of ISO standards and certification of national standards. And I have explained as well the certification process. I hope I have made myself clear. I hope this presentation was of interest to you, and I'm open to questions.
Hello, Miryam. Thank you. This is Holly speaking. I have a quick question, and I apologize. I came in late. It's 6:07 in the morning where I'm from. So,
goodness.
Can you compare, if you know at all, the ISO to the ASTM?
No, I'm afraid I can't do that.
Okay. Because that is although we use ISO in the United States, we also use ASTM, and I was just wondering what the differences were, but that's fine.
Let me just say that ISO standards are international standards. They are, how would I put it? They are official in the sense that they are the consensus of all the different national standardization bodies. Mm-hmm. There may be, of course, in each and every country, and even above certain countries, that is for a few countries together, there may be organizations that say, I am ready to certify that you comply with certain requirements, okay? And that's probably the case of that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. So you may have local or national schemes setting requirements for services or products, And of course, anyone is free to organize themselves around those requirements. Okay, but ISO is the only international organization that includes absolutely all the voices, all the stakeholders, the national standardization bodies. It is the result of consensus. It is very focused nowadays on the needs of the market, to be relevant, to be global. That's all I can say about it.
Okay, toda, thank you.
Any further questions?
Miryam, can I ask a question, please?
Sure.
You mentioned healthcare and safety being prime areas where ISO operates, but this also affects interpreting and community interpreting. And my question is, can we look at it from the SII's perspective? How do they address the current state of practice, and what's their vision in order to ensure that certainly in court interpreting and medical care interpreting in the community care sense rather than in the conference interpretation field, that there is a move towards at least some kind of adoption, even if not formally, of standards. What happens, when government ministries have issue financial tenders to find service providers, and these service providers, the same as in the UK, especially in legal interpreting, but also in medical interpreting and other areas of in other sectors, there is no correspondence between the aspirations of any form of safety and compliance with rational considerations, let alone the standards themselves, particularly on the Israeli end.
Well, let me begin by saying that standards are the theory, and sometimes it has little to do with the practice itself, as you can imagine. So, but I do have to say that health, safety less, but health is definitely taken into account in the last few years. I cannot speak very much about community interpreting or legal interpreting because I'm a conference interpreter and I'm better acquainted with the requirements in terms of conference interpreting. But I can say that, for example, for equipment, okay, there's a range of sound which is allowed, because if there wasn't, then your ears and your hearing could suffer very much in the long term. This is a very hot question in terms of distance interpreting, because people who interpret a lot remotely have found that they are suffering from health issues having to do with tinnitus, for example, with loss of hearing. There's also this technical thing where if you have headphones and the technical equipment is not properly adjusted, you may have booms, and that can affect your hearing, which is fundamental for your profession if you're an interpreter. So health is definitely taken into account in the standards. I invite you to purchase the community interpreting standard or the legal interpreting standard and search for a specific issue. I'm sure that there are chapters dealing with health. But again, this is a standard, and this is precisely why in ISRAIIC we consider that it's very important to insist upon those things, because you can do things properly, and then you can work for a long time without suffering health consequences, or you can give up on the standards, and then at the end of the day you may find yourself without being able to hear properly. So
I'd just like to come back on that. I wasn't so much thinking about the equipment, because I have to say that some of the equipment around in Israel is really shoddy in terms of the sound quality. I'm not even talking about the health protection. I was thinking about having to go in live in the middle of an of COVID epidemic in somewhere, and not having health safety provisions. I was thinking about the quality of the actual interpreting service to the end user being guaranteed more in those directions. If you could, well, could you possibly?
Well, I can tell you that the standards at the very beginning of each standard, quality is fundamental for ISO. The idea is to provide quality, a quality product or a quality service. So in terms of community interpreting and in terms of medical interpreting, the basic idea is always the same: to draft requirements that will allow you as a professional to provide a quality service. If the organizers or the service providers do not comply with those requirements, that's another story. There's nothing you can do to make them. I hope that in the future, these requirements will be compulsory. My hope would be that each country will decide that if you want to provide conference interpreting or community interpreting or medical interpreting, there are a number of requirements that you have to comply with. In the same way as if you're a lawyer, there are certain things you can do or you can't do. If you're a doctor, there are things you can do or you can't do. If you want to sell toys, you have to comply with safety requirements. I hope that in the future, there will be compulsory requirements for services as well. Unfortunately, we're not there yet.
They have no legal binding. It's the standards, no matter whether they're national or otherwise, need to be backed up by law. And
exactly,
at least in my country, good luck with that.
Yeah, and it has to be up to the governments, because you need to have jurisdiction to make something compulsory. ISO has no jurisdiction over the world to make its standards compulsory, but many countries, once an ISO standard is adopted on a specific field, will translate that ISO standard into a national standard, and very often they'll make it compulsory. Unfortunately, not yet for interpreting services. I wish it did. I wish it was compulsory in Israel. I can tell you that the situation of legal interpreting in Spain is the same. It's very bad. In the UK, I'm aware of that as well. The organizers or the people who recruit the interpreting services for the courts do not recruit not even professional interpreters very often. Very often they just take someone who speaks the language, which is appalling, but it's a situation all over.
Thank you.
Any further questions?
Okay, no questions. Thank you for a great talk. This is the second year running that you've been giving a talk in the ITA conference on behalf of ISRAIIC. And this one was just as invigorating as the previous one. It was insightful.